Hello, welcome to Unit 3 of our course. Unit 3 begins on Sunday, June 22nd, and ends on Saturday, June 28th at 11:59 p.m. In this unit, we will be exploring the culture of 1950s America. At the outset, I should say that we're looking really at what historians describe as the long decade of the 1950s, which is more actually than just the 50s. The long decade of the 1950s covers the period from 1945 up into 1964. This era is defined by a very conservative culture, and the reason historians categorize it as this long decade of the 50s is the sort of uniform, conformist culture that existed during this time period. The long decade of the 1950s begins after World War II ends in 1945 and continues on into the early 60s. When we think of the 1960s, we tend to think of the Cultural Revolution, the hippie movement, the Youth Rebellion, but that's really a phenomenon of the later 1960s. The early 1960s was very conservative and very much in keeping with the culture of the 1950s. So, what was the culture of the long decade of the 1950s, if you will? The culture was, as I described it, conservative and traditional. And I'd like to explain a bit why that may have been the case. In 1945, if you were in your 20s in 1945, you had grown up during Depression and war. The Great Depression took place from 1929 to 1940, roughly, and World War II took place from 1941 to 1945. So for a person in their 20s or even early 30s in 1945, they had lived through this long period where there was no security, no ability really to settle down, where there's this great disruption of life. During the Great Depression, people delayed marriage, birth rates were low, suicide rates were high, it was very difficult to settle down and start a family. During World War II, most young men were overseas fighting in the war, and again, it was very difficult to be settled and establish a family life. So by 1945, you might say there's this pent-up demand for quote-unquote normalcy. People who have been denied normalcy as a result of depression and war, many people in this generation, their greatest ambition is to settle down, get married, get a stable job with benefits, purchase a home in a safe community in the suburbs, and lead a quote-unquote normal life. And this is what leads to this culture of the 1950s, if you will. There's a baby boom, there's a high rate of marriage, a baby boom, a large number of high rate of births. People are settling down and starting families. There's mass construction of housing in the suburbs. It's a time of economic prosperity in America, this era from 1945 to 1964. Huge numbers of people are getting jobs in corporate America and settling in the suburbs. The American economy is doing incredibly well. At no other time in American history was the American economy doing as well as this period from 1945 to 1964. America was globally economically dominant around the world. The US dollar was the standard currency, and there was a huge growing middle class in American life. Huge numbers of people were entering the middle class. Veterans of the war were able to gain a college education through the GI Bill. And most people could secure, stable employment during this period. It was an era when most full-time jobs brought generous benefits, pension, health insurance, but there were some more negative aspects to 1950s America, which many people often overlook. So I'd like to address a few of those. One was very traditional gender norms. And I say this was a negative because these gender norms are very confining for men and women. Men and women really didn't have much choice about how they lived their lives. Men and women were expected to behave in a particular way. The dominant image for men was as breadwinners. Men were expected to go to work, to work long hours, to make a good living, to provide for their families. And there was very little acceptance of anything diverting from that. Men were not expected to be homemakers. Men were not expected to provide childcare. Men actually weren't expected to have much of a role, in the upbringing of their children. Men were viewed as perhaps disciplinarians in the home, but there was no expectation that men would be, caregivers, that men would attend children's plays or sporting events or things of that nature. The expectation in corporate America was that men would work 60 or 80 hours a week, that they could work on nights, they could work weekends, and the expectation was men's wives would take care of the children, and therefore men could work any number of hours. They could work nights, they could work weekends. If you were working in corporate America in the 50s, it was not expected that you would have much of a home life, really. Now, of course, some men thrived in this environment and embraced this environment, but there were men who were dissatisfied with this, who felt that they were in this sort of rat race in corporate America, that they were constantly working. The expectation was to keep buying, bigger and bigger houses and more things, yet they were never home. This dissatisfaction was expressed in a book called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. And in this text, there's a description of the sort of stifling nature of the culture of 1950s America for men. The expectations for women were equally stifling, but very different. Women in the 1950s were expected to conform to the image of the homemaker, essentially. Women were not expected to be engaged in paid employment. Women were expected by culture and society to get married, start a family, have children, and devote most of their time to caring for their families. And again, clearly there's nothing wrong with this in terms of people who want to choose to be homemakers. The problem is that women didn't have a choice. This was the overwhelming pressure. Every magazine, every television show, everything conveyed the message that this is what's expected. And women didn't have a lot of opportunity to pursue careers. So the problem is that women didn't really have a choice. They were overwhelmingly pressured. And I think that's the problem in both of these gender norms, that there's a lack of choice. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with a man choosing to devote his life to his career in corporate America and working 80 hours a week. And there's nothing wrong with a woman, obviously, choosing to be a homemaker primarily. But when there's no choice, when there's no opportunity to do something else, then I think it is very problematic from a perspective of liberty, freedom, certainly women's empowerment as well. Women were viewed primarily as domestic and expected essentially to devote themselves to family, and there was it was very difficult for women to get ahead in the 1950s in terms of corporate America or careers. Women were welcomed into service sector jobs, into clerical jobs, secretarial jobs, but it was very difficult to enter the professions for women in the 50s due to discrimination. So that's one of the, I think, very problematic aspects of 1950s culture. A second incredibly problematic aspect of 1950s culture was racial discrimination. African Americans clearly were not treated as equals in 1950s America. African Americans faced segregation in the South, separate schools, separate lunch counters, separate drinking fountains, separate all public facilities were segregated in the American South. And like women, it was very difficult for African Americans, for both African American men and women, in fact, to get ahead economically due to discrimination. While there was an African American middle class, it was certainly much more difficult for African Americans to enter the professions than it was, say, for Caucasians, for whites, due to racism largely. And in the 1950s, you begin to see certainly mass protests against this discrimination. the 1950s is really when the civil rights movement picks up steam and moves forward and begins to push back against this form of discrimination. Women also express discontent with the gender norms that they were subjected to in the 50s. A book called The Feminine Mystique expressed women's discontent with this idea that they should be confined exclusively to the role of homemakers and would not be provided with opportunities in professional life. And you see the formation of the National Organization for Women at the end of this era as well. Your discussion boards deal with these questions. The first discussion board question asks you to consider gender norms, the very limiting expectations of men and women in 1950s America, and to discuss these expectations and your view of these expectations. Again, they were very much conveyed through the media. If you've ever seen shows like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver, they very much convey these gender norms or expectations. Then the second discussion board question asks you to examine the Beats. The Beats were a small group of people in the 1950s, but they're very interesting because they rebelled against mainstream culture. They looked at mainstream culture in the 50s and said, we want nothing to do with this. We don't want to be a part of this mainstream culture. In a sense, they were countercultural before that was mainstream. By the late 60s, it was very much mainstream to be countercultural, to be a hippie, quote unquote. The Beats were a much smaller group, and it was much more controversial to be against the norm in this era. The Beats rejected the notion that they should marry young, settle down, move to the suburbs, and either get jobs in corporate America or be homemakers. The Beats tended to embrace a single life, which was very counterculture. The average marriage age in the 50s was, I believe, 20 to 22 for men and 18 to 20 for women. The Beats said, no, we're not getting married young. We're going to live in the cities in places like Greenwich Village in New York or Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. We're going to live a single life. The Beats also embraced unconventional views of sexuality. 1950s visions of sexuality were very restrictive. The message that was conveyed in the 1950s was that sexuality was only permissible within the confines of heterosexual marriage. The Beats said, no, we're going to explore our sexuality, and the Beats were one of the few people in the 1950s, few groups that accepted, having sexual partners outside of marriage, and the Beats were also welcoming to homosexuals or gay men and women as well. Overall, 1950s culture was very homophobic, very hostile to any kind of homosexuality, I should say. The Beats were different. The Beats did not have this negative stereotype of homosexuality, and a number of prominent Beat writers came out as being openly gay or openly homosexual in 1950s America, which again was very controversial and very unusual in this era. Coming out, I should say, was very unusual. So we'll look at the Beats in the second discussion question. Some of the most famous Beats were writers. Most Beats weren't famous writers, of course, but there were some famous writers amongst the Beats. Allen Ginsberg is one, who was a very famous poet and wrote a poem entitled Howl, in which he rebelled against mainstream culture and rebelled against censorship. Allen Ginsberg is saying, I can write what I want to write when he writes the poem Howl. I have the freedom to express myself, and I don't care if the culture views it as acceptable or not. So we'll look at the Beats in the second discussion board question. Your primary source assignment, you're asked to read two different documents. One is by Allen Ginsberg. It's a selection from Howl. It's a poem of protest. It's meant to be abrasive. It's meant to be jarring. It's meant to be controversial. Howl was actually banned as being profane, as being obscene when it was first released. Today it's regarded as one of the great American poems, and Allen Ginsberg was, a winner of various awards and a professor at prominent universities, but in the 50s he was very, very controversial. He expresses his outrage at this mainstream culture, that this mainstream culture is unjust, that this mainstream culture is discriminatory against racial minorities and women. It promotes this extremely confining conformity. This mainstream culture is promoting militarism and war, so he rejects everything about 1950s culture, really. And this is expressed in his poem Howl. You'll also read a selection from Clark Kerr, The Industrial Man. Clark Kerr was a mainstream academic. He had a very positive view of the new industrial society, and he presents a very positive view of 1950s America in contrast with Allen Ginsberg's Howl. So you get a kind of sense of both perspectives. The film you're watching, I think, is a very engaging documentary. I think it's one of the best documentaries we use in the course, Let Freedom Ring. It covers the civil rights movement. How did African Americans protest for equal rights during this era? So I hope that you'll find this unit to be interesting and engaging, and I look forward to working with you during this unit.